The app is not the important, it's the approach, it's the framework, it's the skill, it's the intention. Don't worry about the app. The app comes secondary. Instead, focus on the app within first.
Hello, creatives. I'm so thankful you're back here with us. This is episode 3, and it's with Mike Vardy, who I am a huge fan of. Mike is an expert in personal productivity and time management and is ready to help you get your productivity back on track. He's the creator of Productivityist, TimeCrafting, and a renowned author and public speaker. And before joining us at the experience this October in Vancouver, Mike is going to bring his wealth of knowledge to the studio to simplify the process of being a more productive and attentive person. By using his background in comedy as a way to stay both entertaining and informative, Mike helps people all over the world define their days, funnel their focus, and make every moment count. Tackling topics like your to-do list, your evening and morning routines, and the importance of which app you interact with, today's episode is necessary for any creative and indeed anyone looking to improve their time management. In this episode, we're going to cover money and time, the currency of life, easy tips to be more productive in everything that you do, journaling and why you should write everything down, how to pick the right app for your productive photography career, and why morning and evening routines can be key to your productivity. Mike is going to talk about crafting your time and crafting your life, building a consistent framework, and how we can each foster freedom. So definitely grab a notepad and a pen because trust me, you're going to need it for this one. Enjoy the show. This episode is sponsored by The Experience. The Experience is a 3-day photography conference happening this October 2018 from the 23rd to the 25th in Vancouver BC. 10 creatives will join us from all over the world, and we have a bonus 4th day of masterclasses in which each of these 10 keynote speakers will be teaching you hands-on in intimate settings so that you can expand your photography business and career. The Experience is for all photographers and creatives from wedding, portrait, commercial, fashion, and fine art communities. The theme this year is the art and business of photography. And if you want to raise the bar for yourself, learn from the best of the best, be a part of a growing supportive community, and take part in our Adventure Day live karaoke evening and party your socks off, we definitely want to see you there. Listeners to this show can save $100 on the ticket price using the code podcast at checkout. That's podcast at checkout. And just head to www.experience.thisisarc.co for more information. So today, my guest is Mike Vardy. I actually came across Mike when I attended the WDS conference last year in Portland and attended one of his productivity workshops. I was really inspired by his ideas and techniques around productivity, and I'm so excited to dive into this and more today. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. So I want to jump right into things. I'd love to hear a bit more about your story. How did you become a specialist in productivity?
So it was a long and winding road that kind of started off in Ontario. I ended up moving out west from the Toronto area to Vancouver, actually. And I was one of the people that opened a Costco in Vancouver because that's where I was. I came from Costco, and then I ended up getting a promotion to work at the Costco in Victoria, which is where I live now. And during that time at Costco in Victoria, I ended up having to run 2 different departments, one at the front of the warehouse, which is the food court, and one at the back of the warehouse, which is service deli. And both those departments are very different types of businesses. You've got the food court, which is kind of the on-demand, can't really prepare too much in advance kind of stuff, almost the impulse buy, hot dog and pop kind of thing. And then in the back, the deli, you had, everything had to be staged, prepared, and there had to be a schedule so that you didn't run out of food at a certain time. So 2 very different departments. And I had to figure out, how am I going to start to balance all of these things? Not to mention the fact that I'm starting to date someone, I want to get the dating scene. And then I all of a sudden fell back in love with comedy and performing, which is something I did a lot of in high school back in Ontario. And so I tried to balance all of these things. And that's when I started to study time management, productivity. So I was studying like Covey and Anthony Robbins, all of the Eisenhower method and David Allen's getting things done. And I started to dive into that. And, as a creative, I dive headfirst in and I swim around in the well for a while and soak it all in. And ultimately what happened is that became my new thing. I started to write online about it, but more in a comedy sense. I was doing a parody of productivity. It was called eventualism. It's what I was doing. So I was basically doing this idea of getting things done eventually. I was doing like a Stephen Colbert-esque take on productivity. And I interviewed like a bunch of really cool people, Seth Godin, who's a well-known online marketing person, Jonathan Colton, who was a singer-songwriter that went from being a software engineer to releasing highly successful podcasts back when podcasts weren't even a thing. And now he's, selling, millions of dollars worth of records a year, and many people don't know who he is. And then David Allen, who is the guy who created the Getting Things Done methodology. And through that, after interviewing him, his people said, you should write for the Getting Things Done blog. And they said, just, write from a legitimate standpoint, don't make fun of us. You make it fun, but don't make fun of us. And ultimately, I started doing that. And then as time went by, I started to write for Work Awesome, which is a website that's still around. I became the managing editor of Lifehack. And slowly, I went away from being the parody of personal productivity to an actual pundit and even a philosopher of personal productivity, which is what I've become. I've gone from being a productivity enthusiast to a specialist to a strategist to now even more of a philosopher. And, I eventually left Costco, and decided to dive into this full time. And I've been doing this actually, as of this year, it's been 8 years full time. But it's been over a decade in its entirety. And, I get to do the performing thing that I was doing with comedy when I get to speak on stage, like I'm going to do at the experience. And I get to do podcasts and interviews, which is something that I really love doing back when I did college radio in Hamilton, Ontario at McMaster University. And I get to help people ultimately through not just performing and speaking and making them laugh and making them feel more engaged with their time, but I also get to help them make better use of their time. So that is the story of me going from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, to a guy who worked at Costco and dabbled in comedy to a guy who now is, living in Victoria, BC, and gets to travel all over the world and gets to write about, something that we all need to invest better.
100%. Wow, that is quite the story. And is comedy still a big part of your life then, or how do you cater to that side of you?
I think what's happened is, as a comedian, there's this great documentary that Jerry Seinfeld was part of called Comedian. And one of the things he said is that as a comedian, you always look through things through the lens of a comedian. So he used an example of when he was on a plane and he goes into the men's restroom. Well, the restroom, it's not just a men's restroom, although that'd be quite the plane. He goes into the restroom and he sees there's a razor disposal unit, which I don't think they have those anymore on planes. But back then they did. And he doesn't think, oh, well, someone needs to put their old blade in there so they can put a fresh blade on so they can shave. In his mind, because he's a comedian, he's thinking, who's going through so many blades on a flight that they need to have the blade disposal unit there? And he says, so a comedian always looks for the extraordinary in the ordinary and the ordinary in the extraordinary. And I think that those sensibilities of me doing comedy have carried over into the way I look at personal productivity and time management. Like one article that I've been working on for a while, I haven't released it yet because I don't want to spoil people when they go see the new Avengers movie, but one of the article's tentative title is How to Thanos Your To-Do List, right? And when I went to the Avengers movie, I wasn't thinking, I know I'm going to take a whole bunch of time management and productivity strategies out of this movie, but my brain just naturally goes there. So I capture things as I do. And I say, oh, you know what? I think I can make something out of this. And that's how I apply it. So I think that while comedy isn't something I necessarily pursue as a craft in and of itself, it's part of what I do. And the sensibilities that allowed me to do improv, which definitely helps when I'm doing workshops and people kind of try to throw me a curveball. They don't know that I've been a stand-up comedian and they don't know that I've done improv. So I can handle that stuff. Having all those skill sets and even the skill sets that I learned from Costco can all be applied to the work I do today. So, I mean, ultimately, I'd like to maybe go back and do some creative work on stage again. I miss doing sketch and improv and theater, but I've got 2 young kids too, right? And there's a time dedication to that too. And you can only do a certain amount of things really, really well. So right now, I've just infused my work with some sprinkles of comedy here and there. But you never know. Down the road, maybe I'll dive back into it, maybe write a comedic novel or a screenplay or just do some funny stuff on stage again. You just never know.
Do you incorporate any comedic stage time into any of your presentations ever?
Oh, I definitely try to make people laugh when I speak. And I mean, there are gags that have shown up in initial talks. So I'll give you an example. And this is something that won't show up when I'm on stage at the event. So this is not a spoiler. This just kind of happened. I was speaking at the National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals Conference in Atlanta a couple of years ago. And I was demonstrating how I capture things. And one of the things that came up was I needed to buy dental floss because I forgot my dental floss at home. And normally I repack my travel bag when I get home, and I just didn't do it. And so I'm sitting there during the Q&A session. People are asking questions and so on and so forth. And at the back of the room, someone steps up to the microphone. And I said, yes, you have a question? She goes, I don't have a question. She goes, I just have dental floss for you. And so she brought up the dental floss, gave it to me. And I said, great, we'll get a picture later. And I go, oh, I forgot to write something down on the thing. I also forgot bourbon. And of course that got so I'm able to react. I infuse things either organically into my talks, but often there'll be things that when I'm writing a talk or when I'm putting together a talk that I will try to create some humor in it because it's disarming. But also, time management is a really dry topic. It just is. And so by making it more human, and one of the best ways to make something human is to bring the humor into it.
Definitely.
I think that makes it more accessible, right? You're drawn to it more. And I feel that that's one of the things when I first started over a decade ago, that's what David Allen and his team saw, is they said, this guy, he understands it. Because the only way you can parody something is if you know it inside and out. You can't satirize something unless you are really, really, you can't bend or break the rules unless you know the rules, 100%. Right? So they saw that and they said, this guy is able to make this kind of subject matter entertaining and informative. We think he would be a great addition and an asset to our blogging team. And I've carried that throughout. I've never lost that sense of play or, kind of candor when it comes to this stuff, because you want to make people embrace it. You don't want to repel people and push them away from it. And I think that when you do that, if you're going to try to be funny or you're going to try to be engaging, the two areas that you really need to work on that, if you're talking about money or you're talking about time, they're, no pun intended, the currency of life. Money is the currency of life, as is time. So I think that when you can engage people as accessible a level as possible, and humor allows you to do that, and the buy-in is much easier, and I've strived to keep that as part of, the ethos of how I operate my company, soon to be renamed TimeCrafting, because I think that that's important to me, and I think it's important to my audience.
Brilliant. And, you mentioned so many things in your bio and even in to do with comedy just there. There's a few things I want to touch upon. One, you mentioned how you capture things. I'm familiar with that term, but could you, for our audience, just explain a little bit about what you mean by when you say you capture things?
So when I capture things, any thought that comes to my mind, whether it's related to a task that I might want to do now or later, or an idea that I might want to pursue now or later, I capture it, which means I get it out of my head and put it in some place that I trust. And more often than not, that initially goes onto paper. And the thing is, when I say capture it, it's a strategic. It's not like, I collect it or I write it down on a scrap of paper. Even if I write something down on a scrap of paper, I have a very specific way of doing that. So if I'm going to look at it later, I don't say to myself, what does this mean? Like I've created it. I call it the map, which is, every action requires a mode, which is the M, the A is the action, and the P is the project. So if I'm writing down these actions either sequentially, so as they come to me, because that's the way they would come to you, is you're not going to necessarily organize them by a modality or a project, but then I'll assign a mode to it. So that way, if I'm writing down phone bill, the mode will be either phone, right? Like I need to pick up the phone to do that. Or maybe it's low energy because Bill's really easy to talk to. Or maybe it's a 5-minute phone call, so the mode will take me 5 minutes to do it. So that way, when I look at this thing, instead of looking at this phone bill, I'm like, which bill? How bill? Am I phoning about a bill? What's the, having all that stuff, I can look and go, oh, I only have 5 minutes. What can I do in 5 minutes? Oh, I can phone Bill. Or I can phone Bill. Oh, I don't have the energy to talk to Bill right now. Or I have high energy and I'm going to save that talking to Bill later when I have lower energy. So when I say capture, it's about just getting things. And David Allen's talked about this, this idea of mind like water. My philosophy is, and I've used this before, again, having worked for Costco, is your mind was meant to be a factory, not a warehouse. So, don't store things there. Have some place to look at, like have a manifest to look at and say, oh, here's all the things that I want to work on, and let the mind do the real work, which is the working on it.
Awesome. And so as a serial note taker, I've implemented methods that you've used, but there was a time whereby I would just write notes on my phone, write notes in a notepad, write notes wherever there was like a spare file on my computer, and everything gets a bit all over the place, shall we say, or even in a calendar, or you email yourself a note. And I know a lot of creatives may deal with something very similar. Do you have a tool or a technique that somebody listening to this right now could take away and implement just slowly a methodology starting from tomorrow in which way they could be more productive in some of the tasks that they have to do?
Well, first off, carry around a notebook with you wherever you go if you can. Because, a lot of people say, oh, well, I've got my digital device, I've got my phone. The phone battery could run out. There's so many different things that can go on. Plus, you are not just connected to yourself. It's more of a device to connect you to everybody else, and vice versa. Whereas a notebook, a notification is not going to pop up. You're not going to get disrupted. So if someone is sitting down talking to you, you can actually write things down in a notebook. And by all accounts, they should know that you are actually paying attention to what they are saying. Secondly, have a consistent way of writing things down that you use across all of the ways or places you might write them down, which is why I came up with a map, because an action on paper can be a task in a to-do list application. A mode can be a tag in a to-do list application. So having something like that would be beneficial. And then I think the third thing, which you could start doing right away above all else, is have less places that you like. Instead of just writing things down in a random place, pick a place. Hey, I'm at home. I only write things down in this notebook. I'm out. I've got this notebook I bring with me. That's where it goes. And then, when I get home after a day of going around, I've got my notebook. All I do is I take that notebook and throw it in my paper inbox. And, I can look at it and know immediately. I don't have to remember what I wrote down in the notebook because it will tell me by looking at the modes and the actions. But all I need to remember when I get home is, did I write anything down in this notebook? Oh, I did. Then it goes to the inbox. Like, that's what you need. So not, what did I write down? I don't care about that at that point in time. Later, when I'm processing it, sure I will, but not right now. So I think it's about having, especially when you're first starting out, because when you're first starting out, you're going to have places. It's about culling the amount of places that you're going to capture this stuff and being very intentional about doing that. So if you're a Post-it note person, fine. Only write things down on Post-it note when you're at home, but have a way of looking at the Post-it notes that go, oh, these are the actions and these are the modalities and these are the because I've done the map on a Post-it note, a napkin, in Excel, in Evernote, you could do them in so many different places. It's the framework that needs to be consistent, because once you have a framework, then you start to foster freedom because you don't have to think about it twice. It's kind of like you're using like a fridge and a freezer. You know what belongs in the freezer, you know what belongs in the fridge. You're not going to put stuff in the fridge that belongs in the freezer because that's the framework. The framework is freezer freezes stuff, fridge keeps stuff cool, and then the pantry keeps stuff that's neither cool nor frozen. Like, it's the same principles. When you're writing stuff down, it's like, okay, this is where this goes. And it's hard to break the habit of having so many places. Like, create an environment where it's like, hey, all I have here are Post-it notes. Therefore, that's what it is. Or all on my iPhone home screen or in the dock, the only thing is this app that I use that I capture things in. It's about creating environments and frameworks so that the future you, the one that's going to try to do this a month down the road, it has something to look to. It has something to say, hey, this is how we've done it before. Because, how you live your days is how you live your life, right? So that's really key. So first thing, be deliberate and intentional about where you capture things. Secondly, capture in a way that when you look at it later, you could understand it. Better still, capture in a way where if you were to hand it to somebody, they'd at least be able to understand what you wrote down, even if they don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
So you should be able to hand it and say, oh, phone Bill. Well, and it says it will take 5 minutes. What am I talking to Bill about? Like, you can give them all that information, but they should be able to look at it and go, I know what this says. I don't know what it necessarily how to do it, but I know what this says. And I can at least get started with it, or at least ask informed questions about it. And then, finally, if you decide that you're going to use a digital tool as well, just transfer how you write things down in analog form to digital. So when I write something down on a piece of paper, using this, I know that all the modes are going to be tags inside of Todoist, if that's what you use, or Asana or Trello or any of the umpteen number of apps, because the apps don't matter. I mean, think about it this way, and I'll bring it to, kind of the audience that we have here. It's like if you are a master photographer, a really good photographer, I handed you like a point and shoot. And if you handed me like the best DSLR camera possible, you would still take better shots than me because you can work with that tool far better than I can work with the best tool on the market. Sure, the best tool on the market might make me look better than I am, but if you were to hand me the crappy camera, you'll see where all my flaws are. Same principles. The app is not the important. It's the approach. It's the framework. It's the skill. It's the intention. Don't worry about the app. The app comes secondary. Instead, focus on the app within first.
Awesome. That's great advice. And going into the modes and the time slots that you're assigning each of the projects or tasks that you have to do, there's nothing more satisfying than knowing that you've got a bit more low energy and then crossing off a lot of those little 5-minute tasks. I found that really, really helpful for myself. And
it helps you to say, okay, you know what? I'm not a morning person, so let me do all the low energy or the 5-minute tasks early in the day. Or maybe you are a morning person, in which case you're going to save those tasks for later in the day. It just gives you a way of looking at your to-do list. Instead of looking at it in kind of a sequential order, You look at it in an order that is more human. It makes sense the way you would look. Like, I'm going to group all my tasks by low energy. I'm going to group them all by the amount of time they're going to take. I'm going to group them all by, I need to go into Photoshop right now. What am I going to do when I'm in Photoshop? You're not going to jump all over the place because that's ineffective and inefficient and ultimately inhumane.
Definitely. Just while we're on this subject, you mentioned a few apps, and I know you said obviously the approach is the most important thing. Could you touch upon just a few quick apps as to what you may recommend, or maybe just one, in fact, that people could download and start using?
Yeah, let me preface it by saying,
sure.
When people ask me to recommend apps, the first thing I will say is I don't know what app to use. And the reason is because there's so many variables. So when you're picking an app, you have to decide, are you more of a Windows user or are you a Mac user? Are you going to use iOS more than, say, Windows? Like, how many people? Is it just for you, or are you working with a team? Like, there's a lot of variables to consider, but all the good ones will have the following capabilities. They'll have the capability for you to divide your tasks into projects. You'll also be able to tag or label them. If you have those, and flagging is a nice thing to have, and start dates are a nice thing to have, and the good ones also won't say like due date, it'll be like schedule, because due dates are dangerous. Due dates you always work towards, like cramming for an exam. What a date should mean in an app is, this is when I want this to come to my attention. Not when it's due, but this is when I want to be reminded about it all.
Sure.
So I think if you are someone who really likes a minimal, clean interface, you want to be able to work individually, but you might want to add a couple people to it. And you want something that works on a variety of platforms, Windows, Mac, iOS, Android. Todoist is a really good one. It's about $30 a year. I mean, and again, if you're going to use an app, pay for it, for crying out loud. I know there's lots of free ones out there, but your time is worth money. And for $30 a year, that's what, less than, it's just a ridiculously low amount per month. If you broke it down by month, it's crazy. And your time is definitely worth more than that. Free apps are never truly free. But this Todoist is really good because you can create filters, which is great. So you could say, I want to see all the things that I've labeled with Photoshop that are due in the next 2 weeks, and you'll see it. I want to see all the things that I've flagged orange that have the tag email that I need to do over the next 30 days. And you can see that. So it allows you to really customize things. It's a nice clean interface. It's got location awareness built in. So let's say you're doing a location shoot. You could say, hey, when I leave my house, so I want Todoist to trigger an action to say, hey, don't forget your green screen. Don't forget, your softbox, like anything like that, right? So if you're working with a larger team and you want to start using things like timelines and dependent tasks, Asana, which has been around for a long time, is a good one to choose. I use that for my entire team because, I can invite guests. I can have coaching clients in there. I can create some permissions around it. It's a lot more robust. It definitely looks more like a Windows type of app, but it's really got some nice clean lines in terms of, you can have conversations inside of it. So you don't need to use a tool like Slack. You can keep your email, instead of using a ton of email, you can keep the communication internal. And by the way, the other reason I mentioned just these two is because they are both well-funded, either bootstrapped well-funded, or let's put it this way, the guys who founded Asana were two of the first employees ever for Facebook. They're two of the richest people that you could meet, and they are committed to this project. So I would say that those two are probably the best in terms of multi-platform scalability and really user-friendliness. It gives you a lot of room to work with. So I would say those two are probably your best bet.
Thank you. And continuing along the topic of energy and talking about morning people, things like that, whereby some people may be low energy in the morning and they work through certain tasks. I'd love to focus a little bit on your routine a little bit. And what do your mornings look like? Do you have a morning routine? Do you have an evening routine that helps you bookend your days to make you a bit more productive?
It's like you've heard me talk about this before. I am a big believer in morning and evening routines, because they do bookend your day. They are the constants. And I believe that with routines, you start small, because routines are just habits stacked upon each other. So if you want to start establishing a morning or an evening routine, start with like 3 things. So initially when I started to have a morning routine, it was like splash water on my face 3 times, kind of like what Jerry Seinfeld would do. Make a pot of coffee, read for 25 minutes. That was it. Then all of a sudden I started to add things like make my NutriBullet shake. I started to add a few things. I think I've got about 6 steps to my morning routine now. And instead of splashing water on my face now, I've got a rain shower in the bathroom. So I just dunk my head under the rain shower and it totally gets my hair all wet so I can style it so I can look at least somewhat decent in the morning if I want. I'm more of a night owl. So my morning routine isn't nearly as important to me as my evening. which is all about setting things up so that I have lower value decisions to make in the morning. So for example, I can tell you like tonight I'll prepare my breakfast before going to bed. So I'll get NutriBullet shakes all set up in the fridge. Or sometimes I'll even go so far as to put the bowl out, spoon out, and the cereal box out the next morning. Yeah, like I just set it up. I get my coffee set up. So that way when I wake up, I could literally be the zombie that walks around and does that stuff. I pick my clothes out for the next day. So they're already sitting at my bed. I journal at night. So I'm a big believer in journaling. That's the last thing I do from the office, because what that does is it signifies what my most important tasks are going to be for the next day. And because I theme my days, which I'm going to dive into a little bit more during my presentation, but also during some of the other stuff we're going to do, I can look at the next day and say, what does tomorrow mean? Oh, it means this. Therefore, these are the tasks I'm going to tackle. Hey, here's how today went, et cetera, et cetera. And then I can close my office door and know that I'm ready for the next day. Because when I show up the next morning, again, brain dead zombie needs to look at this and go, what was I going to do? Because brain dead zombie guy will look at the shiny new object. Like that's what I'll do. So my evening routine is really important. And I think it's important for you to have both, because the morning routine kicks off your day and the evening routine really sets up the next day for success. And then once you've got those, it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, right? You've done the border. You're always going to start with those edge pieces, right? But then the middle is, you don't know what the middle is going to look like. If the day goes off the rails, at least at the end of the day, you know you've got your journal to write, you know you've got your clothes to put out, you know you've got your breakfast to deal with, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, you know, if you don't have an evening routine, you don't have a natural shutdown method for the end of your day. It's just kind of the day ends abruptly and then the next morning starts. And if you're a morning person, one of the worst things you can do is plan your next day the next morning. You should be, if anything, just right into action mode, like just get going, right? Whereas for me, I do my low energy stuff in the morning generally. And then what'll happen is by the time the afternoon hits, like as we're recording this, I'm starting to hit my stride really. So that's when I start to do the writing, the video making, the deep dive into coursework, stuff like that. That's when I've got my own energy and I've saved my energy up. In the mornings, I'm often feeding off the energy of others. I'll see coaching clients in the morning. I'll do that kind of stuff because they're giving me the energy, which I did learn from comedy. That's another thing I took from comedy is that, you know, if you have an audience of 3 people and there's 7 people on the stage, you are not going to be able to fuel that show with the audience that's there unless they are like a crazy, crazy audience. But if you've got 7 people on stage and 50 people in the audience, 100, 200, that energy from that audience, it can either lift your presentation up or it could be sucked right out of the room. So it's about, like, when it's just you, right? So me with another person, because these people are coming to me for coaching advice or whatever, I raise my game up to meet them. It's kind of like in a sport, you know, another sports analogy would be like, if you're playing a better team, you're going to naturally raise your level of your game up because you know you're against the better team, right? Whereas if you're not against the better team, you might not play to your full potential, right? So I think that having those morning and evening routines allows you to deal with the messy middle of the day, and it creates cadence around your workflow, which, you know, you need to have, whether you're a creative or not.
Definitely. And so, you know, you've mentioned a lot of things here, you know, with regards to theming and knowing your days and knowing your energy even. I'd love to go into theming later and actually discuss a bit more about your presentation at ARC. But before we do that, how does one even kind of know where their energy levels are? Because for me personally, after I shoot a wedding on a Saturday, my Sundays, I'm completely wiped. And Monday, I feel like really fresh, ready to go. My mornings can sometimes be different from my evenings, depending on if I'm working out or if I have meetings and things like that. So first of all, how does one manage their energy and then know that this is the right direction to go in with that energy?
Well, here's the key thing is you said depending on if, and that's where you have control. So for example, you said depending on if I work out. So let me ask you this. Do you have a consistent workout routine?
Pretty much.
So when is that generally?
As soon as I wake up in the morning, I do a certain routine of exercises. There has actually recently switched to being a lot more strenuous, I would say, in the morning. So I'm actually not as energized.
It comes later. Your energy, you hit a dip, but then it comes back up again later. Right. So that's one way is you go, hey, you know, I'm recognizing, and journaling is such a huge part of this too. We haven't really touched on that yet, but you know, as I said, I journal at night. By journaling every day, I keep myself from having to do like, you know, like a weekly or bi-weekly review, or weekly review rather, to the same degree as some other people, because I can look at my journal entries and I can see the ebb and flow, right? So you could do things like, what's my energy like on Mondays? You could put that into your journal, you know, like, hey, Energy level, 7 out of 10. Okay, what about next Monday? Oh, it's 9 out of 10. Okay, well, Mondays seem to be pretty good. Okay, so I'm going to start to stack my tasks that are high energy on those days, right? But I think that when you put variables in, like, depending on, or in those instances where or on the occasions, once you start putting those like variables in there, things get muddy, right? Like, there's a reason that, I theme my days. It's because, like, today, well, when we were trying to arrange this, I asked, could we do this on a Wednesday? And you knew why. But most people don't, because I don't really say, like, we do this on Wednesday because Wednesday's my audio day, because they go, what's that even mean? But I know that Wednesday I am geared up for audio. Like, if you were to look at me right now, you'd be like, yeah, you certainly are. Because I'm not, I'm wearing a ball cap, I'm unshaven, but that's what today is. So it allows me to wake up in the morning and go, not what am I going to do today, but what day is it? Oh, it's Wednesday. Wednesday's audio day. Okay, what audio am I going to attack? And then I've got this funnel of focus, and then energy plays a role for me. Like, oh, well, what audio tasks are going to take high energy? Which ones are going to take low energy? Well, for me to record openings for the next 5 weeks of podcasts is really low energy. I could do that in my sleep, but I've got an ad spot to record. Well, that's going to take high energy, so I'll do that later in the day. So it's about creating these waypoints for yourself. And again, this is the other thing that drives me nuts about a lot of productivity methodologies and philosophies. A lot of do it all now, or you're not doing it, right? Like, I'm going to read this productivity book, or I'm going to read about the system, and I'm going to adopt all of it. You can't do that. It's like you just said about working out. Like, look, you've adopted a more strenuous workout routine. You're feeling the effects of it, right? Like, the long term is going to be helpful, but you're going to feel the effects. And what happens when people often take on New Year's resolutions? I'm going to work out, and what happens by week 6? Not only are they not working out as strenuously, they're just not working out, right? So what happens is people take on these productivity, like, I'm going to do the Pomodoro technique and I have to do it for every task. And then all of a sudden they're realizing they're changing a timer every 25 minutes. They're like, there's part of your brain that will always go, why am I doing this? I know what I need to do. You don't. I know it's going to take me. You don't. Like, it's that amygdala, the primitive part of your brain that's saying, oh, we've got this. Why are you doing all this extra work? Because the primitive part of your brain just wants to screw around. It just wants to do like whatever it wants to do. It's not thinking about the future. It's just thinking about the now. So when you're putting this kind of stuff together, you have to say, okay, historically, like, this is what my energy levels are like. So let me work with this and we'll see what happens. And let me theme one day of the week, or let me theme one block of hours during the week, like from 9 to 11, Monday through Friday, and set that up for high energy work, because that's when I know that I'm normally at my best. And then categorize your tasks as such, and then try it. And if it works, then you're like, oh, I wonder what it would look like if I categorized and did the same thing for my low energy ones. Or what if I did this for a day of the week and said, you know what, Fridays, I don't want to do any meetings. So what if I just made Friday like a deep work day? And I blocked off my calendar and I started to create boundaries around that, because people try to book time with me on Fridays. I say no. I'm like, I don't really do meetings on Fridays, but how about this? I'll give them an alternate, or I'll give them my scheduling link, which makes it even more hilarious, because then they don't know. They just say, wow, look at all the free time Mike's giving me. But they don't notice that there's no Friday. They just see like every other, but that's fine. Like, so it's about creating boundaries for yourself. It's knowing yourself first, right? Saying, hey, this is what I've seen. Creating boundaries so that you work within that data that you have, and then respecting those boundaries, which is the hardest part, is to say, I'm going to commit to this for a month and I'm going to chronicle this data so I can have anecdotal evidence of how this is working. The problem with this is the third step people often give up on, because they're just like, well, one day it didn't work. So they give it up completely. They're like, it didn't work. Knew it. I knew it. That's it. I'm not going to do it. And that's like, again, that's the whole New Year's resolution idea, right? So it's just about getting that and then experimenting with, and then adding or subtracting. Like, if you're like, hey, I'm going to theme all 7 days of the week, and you find that like the weekends, you're like, this seems too rigid, and then you just stop theming your weekend days, or you don't theme every block of time during the day, then that might be your answer. Personal productivity is super subjective, because productivity is really about intention. What is my intention? What do I want? What do I need and want? And then attention. How am I going to pay attention to that? It's not about speed first. It's not about effectiveness first. Those are byproducts of that, because you could be as fast as you want, but if you're not doing the things you want to do, what's the point? And you could be as effective as you want, but if you're not doing the things that you want, what's the point, right? So I think you have to look at the past and you have to kind of keep tabs. It's a lifestyle. It's not a diet. It's a lifestyle. We only have the time that we have. And once it's gone, it's gone. So why not invest it? Invest your free time. Invest it in the things that matter. Invest it in the things that you really need and want to do. And get rid of all the things that you think you ought to do. Make decisions about those. I ought to go take that photography class. Yes or no? If you're not going to do it now, but you want to, then mark it as something you want to do, but look at it later down the road. Maybe you've got a monthly theme for education, and that's when you look at it. I know this is a long, long answer, but the point is, it's all about awareness, and awareness is where you have to begin. And in order to be fully aware, you have to be truly honest with yourself, and that can be painful.
Totally. And this is where the philosopher part of you comes out, and I feel that as creatives, setting boundaries can be really hard because sometimes we don't know where the next booking is going to come from or where the next job is going to come from. And so, somebody inquires for a job in July. July is a month that you've set aside for some rest and recovery potentially, but you want to take on that booking. How does one create a boundary and say no because you've committed a certain amount of time, whatever that may be, to a different task?
So this is, again, we're kind of diving into a bit of a theming thing here with monthly themes. So let's say, for me, actually, it's a great example. July is my self-care month for both the personal and professional thing. July is kind of a chill month for me. But if someone was to say to me, hey, Mike, we want you to come and do this project, all that is an abstraction in the month. It's not an overarching focus because my overarching focus is self-care. So, if I take on a project in July, then that is simply an abstraction along the way. Now, let's say we take on one, but then all of a sudden you get another booking. Hey, I'd like you to take on two. You have to start thinking about this against, first off, your plan for the year. Like, will taking on this extra gig help me with, in my 3 words this year, were redesign, rebuild, and reclaim. So remember, it's not will taking on this project, will taking on this second project, like getting really clear, help me. Well, yeah, it'll help me. It'll help me reclaim some cash. So sure. Will it help me redesign my business? Well, no, because I'm kind of following this Jerry Maguire ethos of fewer clients, but, better quality output. So I'm going to say, no, it won't. What about, rebuild? Well, again, if I'm rebuilding myself to the point where I want to be able to deliver better quality results to every client, then maybe that's a no. So all of a sudden you've got 2 of the 3 words where it's a no. At that point, that to me says it's a no. So I think that, again, it's very subjective. But if you have these little clues, these little waypoints, these little triggers to help you, then you're going to be able to say, you know what, this is going to be far easier. And the other thing is you can set limits well in advance. You could say, you know what, my rule is I only do 2 projects a month, period, across the board. And if you've committed to 2 and a third one comes along, you've got to be willing to say no. And I get that, believe me, I'm a creative too. Like I write, I film, I do all that stuff. You have to not only be able to be willing to say no, but you have to create an infrastructure that allows you to say no. So it can't be like, I know that July, August, and those are wedding season times. And if you've decided, hey, you know what? I don't really do a lot of weddings, but that's the kind of thing that's the backbone of my business because, it's kind of like Michael Caine, who he does like really nice art films, but then you get a tour of his house and he says, this room was paid for by Under Siege 2. And this room was paid for by, we get that, right? So then this, and that's a certainty. So you say, you know what, July and August are not good months for self-care because if I'm going to do weddings at that time, maybe my month for self-care is like January. And one of my goals is if I'm living in a cold place is to go travel to Bali for that month or whatever, right? Maybe that's when I do, tours. I've got actually one client who is a photographer and we set up his monthly themes. And he said, I need to do weddings. I'm like, well, when's wedding season for you? Like, that's a certainty. He goes, well, when is the most of the critical mass? And he says, these are them. Great. So what if a wedding comes along outside of that? Because I'm more apt to say no. I'm like, well, especially if you've got other things on the go. So it's about crafting your time and saying, you know what? I need to set some boundaries around this. And it's not realistic for me to say July is a good month for self-care because that's when wedding season is. But October works better. Yeah. And, being a creative entrepreneur, that involves making hard choices to have the great freedom that we, what's that saying that the great Ben Parker said, great power requires great responsibility or whatever like that. Like, I think that's being an entrepreneur is very powerful, involves a lot of responsibility. So it's just about setting good boundaries and making them realistic, right? Like, there's a creative in San Francisco Mike Montero, and he runs Mule Design. They only have 6 clients that they work with ever. And they have a backlog of people who want to work with them. But they were very clear. We only work with 6 people. Why? Because we can give 6 people the best attention possible. They're going to get the best results. They dive really deep. And I mentioned the Jerry Maguire thing. It was on TV a week or so ago. And I'm like, I did a talk at Social Media Camp. The core message of the talk was do less better. Like have less social media accounts and do them better. And the buddy I was sitting with, we were having a beer, and he says, that's Jerry Maguire. And I said, what? He goes, yeah, that's Jerry Maguire's mission statement. I'm like, really? It was on TV and I watched it. And I mean, it is to a certain degree. He was being very reductive. But if you watch that movie and you see what he does, he works with less people, but man, those relationships are super solid. And maybe that's the way you want to go, or maybe you don't want to be that way. But once you get clear about that, then you can craft your time around that. Because I'm not a big believer in New Year's resolutions at all. I'm a big believer in monthly projects / goals, monthly initiatives. And then beyond that, you're working on things like virtue, character, integrity, like the things that are going to carry you through. And this is kind of some of the stuff I'll touch on during our talk, but stuff that's going to carry you through beyond 2018, 2019, 2030, 2050. Like the things that you want to be remembered for, because no one's going to remember you for the fact that you didn't have room on your calendar in July. But what they are going to remember you for is, wow, you know what? Mike delivered that project, and those wedding photos, they were amazing. And I remember just the communication that we had. It was awesome. And oh man, like I'm so glad that I went down this. They're going to remember you for not necessarily the fact that you didn't have time or whatever. They're going to look at the quality of what you put out, not just in terms of the project, but the character, what went into that. That's what really this is all about. It's about crafting a life. And the way you can craft a life that's worthwhile is by spending your time in worthwhile endeavors.
Beautiful. Mike, I'm so excited to hear you at the experience in October. And I'd love for you to, touch a little bit about what you'll be speaking about and a little bit about the class that you'll be doing, because along with every keynote presentation, we have a class that is dedicated to audience members that's a bit more intimate and gives them the opportunity to spend more time with you. So I guess first starting off with the presentation, could you discuss a bit of that for us, please?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about basically one of the things that we struggle with, time management's a struggle we all have. It doesn't matter whether you're creative or otherwise. And in the talk, I'm going to really kind of talk about what's the one thing that I kind of recognized after studying things. And I started doing it about a decade ago. And through that, it's kind of compounded to the point where I now have this one real strong way of looking at time that allows me to structure my days, my weeks, my months, and beyond in a way that I don't feel as overwhelmed. I have this understanding that there is only one me and this is what I can accomplish. It's allowed me to kind of craft this life that I have with my family and with my clients and with my work. That's just been truly, enlightening, eye-opening, delightful. The workshop's going to dive into the very specific strategies and tactics, and it'll be very hands-on. And we've talked about this before. It's like in a keynote, I don't want people to walk away and go, holy smokes. I want the aha moment to be there, and that's the moment I had when I kind of put all of this stuff together. But in the workshop, the masterclass, it's going to be, here's piece by piece, step by step, how you can do this for yourself. And again, not just in your business, but in your life. Because, and this is something I definitely touch on, is I'm not a big believer in work-life balance. I think that balance is a very poorly used term when it comes to that. I'm more about work-life harmony. Right? Because when you're done running your business, you probably will still take photos, and you may never fully be done because you might sell prints. And that means you just slow down your business. I'm a writer. I will never not write. I will go back to comedy. I will always make people laugh. But if I'm talking about balance, then that means almost like removing something or lessening something on both sides. Whereas harmony is almost like a tapestry, right? Like if you're taking something, if you're looking at a piece of art, if it gets too busy, then it's not very harmonious. But if things are placed nicely, think about a song, right? You could have a melody and then you add a harmony and another harmony, and all of a sudden you've got a completely different sounding song. But it just sounds fuller. It sounds more beautiful, or whatever you want, or a different kind of beautiful. So I'm going to kind of go over that a little bit, in my talk, the very, kind of the one big lesson. And then in the masterclass, we'll get our hands dirty.
Fantastic.
But the good kind of dirty. The good kind of dirty.
For sure. For sure. One thing I want to mention is that the productivity side of being a creative is so important. And I personally learned so much from Mike. It's a course that I really want everyone to have the opportunity to do. And typically in the last few years, we've always had the masterclasses the day before the conference. But this time we're going to do things a bit different. The date is soon to be announced. But this class, I want everybody to have the opportunity to experience. And the whole team at ARC feels the same. And we really, what we're going to do is we're going to have a few weeks after the conference, this special masterclass with Mike, so that everyone has the opportunity to go and experience that and have a lot to take away from it too.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I wanted to do in the talk is kind of give you something to think about, so that way you can come to that class with that awareness, with that kind of armament that you need. And then when you go into the class, you'll be able to kind of build upon that. And I think that giving some fallow time, I think is important in these situations, because what I talk about, you saw me speak at WDS, it's a bit of a it's not a bit of a mindset shift. It's kind of a shock to the system in some respects. And you need to be able to sit back and go, okay, hold on. What is, like, how do I feel about it? Like, how can I make this work even just a little bit? Like, I think you need that there. And the nice thing is of course, along the way leading up to the masterclass, I'll be at the conference, I'll be at the whole experience, the event. We can stay connected. So that way the steps leading up to the masterclass, you're not feeling like you're left twisting in the wind or feeling your way around in the dark. You're, kind of getting yourself ready. It's like gearing yourself up for a nice little marathon. So
brilliant. Fantastic. And we're excited to have you there too. And you mentioned between the keynote and the masterclass having some tips and, helping with that mindset shift. Is there anything for our attendees who are coming in October that they could implement now? Like one tip that they could see themselves action that could help them be more productive by October?
The biggest thing that you can do right now, and again, I kind of touched on, is start to journal what you're doing daily. Like, just start keeping a journal. I have a link that we can go to that you can also go to, and we'll share that in the show notes, that you can go to kind of get some additional resources to warm you up. We'll use productivityist.com/arc. I think that's probably the best one. That'll give you some additional resources to kind of get you prepared. But I definitely think the biggest thing you can do, which is kind of, again, it sounds kind of weird, is to just start to chronicle. There's a reason there's an app called the 5-Minute Journal app, and there's a reason there's a book called the 5-Minute Journal. You could take 5 minutes of your day and just say, hey, what did I do today? What did I do today I wanted to do? What didn't I do today that I wanted to do? Why? Just that will get you prepared for the journey that we're all about to go on.
Thank you so much. 100% agree with that. And the 5-minute journal for me has been a bit of a game changer. I absolutely love writing and journaling in that every morning and every evening, and highly recommend that to anyone who's thinking about purchasing it. One last question that I have for you is, you mentioned a lot of gurus and people that you've connected with, like Seth Godin, like Tony Robbins and David Allen. Is there one takeaway that you could distill about these guys and what you've learned from them that you could share with us?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway I've had is that, while business isn't always personal, productivity is. Like, I think that the biggest thing is that I've noticed through all of these different methodologies that are touted and preached and stuff, is that every one of them has merit. And I think what you need to do is you need to kind of take, like Tony Robbins does this very expertly, is he takes different elements from different things he's learned and apply them to his own business, and he teaches that stuff. And I think that when you look at, even David Allen, like the tickler file, which is mentioned in Getting Things Done, that thing is from the 1800s. Like, it's not like it's brand new. I think the biggest takeaway is that there are so many different tactics and tools. The biggest thing that you could do is, through people like me and these people, is to say, okay, I want to learn about them, but then I want to craft my own system about it and start small and work my way from there. And I think that maybe the second thing is, and this is more of a general thing, is if you're ever concerned about whether or not your stuff is out there and you're creating new stuff and you think, I got to create something new because of something old that I made, everyone's already seen it. They haven't. There are people, when I mention David Allen's Getting Things Done, I have in my mind that everyone knows who he is. They don't. There are people who don't know. So don't let your ego get in the way, I think, is another thing that I think that you could take away from. And that's from Ryan Holiday for sure. I've learned that from Ryan Holiday, who I really admire as a creator, is this idea that remove your ego from the situation in a lot of cases, because when you do that, then you're going to be open to new ideas and new ways of looking at things. Because once the ego's there, the ego can be, well, as he said, the ego can be the enemy. So I think those two things, there's value in that old Bruce Lee adage of take what's useful and remove what isn't. And then also remove your ego from the situation whenever you can. Check your ego at the door.
100%. Mike, I absolutely really loved speaking to you today, and I'm so excited to have you drop even more knowledge this October. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I know our audience does too.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing everybody in October.
Well, how was that, guys? To learn more about Mike, he can be found online at productivityist.com and on other social platforms from Twitter to YouTube via @Productivityist. Hit up Mike and tell him what you thought, and tell us too. You can find us at ArcThisIs. One of my key takeaways from this episode is where Mike talked about how you live your days is how you live your life, and where he spoke about achieving work-life harmony. Sometimes in my day-to-day, I've definitely felt burnt out at times, overworked, fatigued, unable to relax, or even unable to see my family and friends. Each day I strive to improve on this so that I can craft a life that makes me happier and healthier. As creatives and entrepreneurs, I feel we have the opportunity to design and live a pretty incredible life. But it doesn't come without its challenges, of course. And so it's my wish that others can achieve work-life harmony too, and I'm learning each day and progressing. But how about you? What is one thing that you'll action today from this episode? Will you start a new morning or evening routine? Are you going to pick up a journal or a notepad? How will you theme your days? Join the conversation, use the hashtag #TheArcCreativePodcast and tweet us at ArcThisIs. We'd love to hear from you. Finally, thank you so much for your time, and to stay connected with us here at Arc, check us out on iTunes. Subscribe to the show for more episodes with Levi Tijerina, Carrie and Nicole from Junebug Weddings, Nikki Boone, Hugh Whitaker, and so many more. If you're in a creative community or you know someone who'd enjoy the show, we'd absolutely love it if you could share a link with them. Thank you to all of you who left us great reviews after our show only released last week. We've had great feedback, and please continue to rate and leave a written review on iTunes. They are hugely appreciated by myself and the whole team. Once again, I'm your host, Sachin Khona, and with maximum love and gratitude on your creative journey, we'll catch you next week for another episode with the Art Creative Podcast and my guest, Junebug Weddings. Hugs and high fives. Peace.